During World War II, the Balkans became the scene of one of the most mysterious and dramatic operations of the 20th century. The secret mission of Tito and Stalin changed the course of Yugoslavia's history. The partisan movement, born in the underground, came under the close control of the great powers. How did Moscow control the struggle for freedom? What secrets were hidden in the negotiations? And why did the alliance between the two leaders end in a spectacular breakup? This is a story of power, loyalty, intrigue, and the price of independence that still excites the minds of historians and descendants of the resistance fighters. In the early 1940s, the Balkans found itself at the epicenter of a global confrontation. After the invasion of Yugoslavia by the Third Reich and its allies, the country was dismembered and puppet regimes were established on its territory. However, despite the chaos and repression, a resistance movement quickly emerged among the people. At its core was the illegal but well-organized Communist Party of Yugoslavia. In the first months of the occupation, the Communists, led by Josip Broz Tito, began to prepare an armed uprising. By the spring of 1941, meetings were being held in secret apartments in Zagreb and Belgrade to decide the fate of the future struggle. Members of the party's Central Committee were tasked with traveling to different regions of the country: Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia, to set up underground organizations and prepare the population for resistance. During this period, the Communist International, or Comintern, played a special role, coordinating the actions of left-wing movements throughout Europe. Correspondence, exchange of experience, and even support in the form of weapons and instructions were carried out through secret channels. Although bound by a pact with Germany, the Soviet Union continued to monitor the situation in the Balkans and sought ways to influence the Yugoslav communists. Illegal leaflets distributed among workers and peasants called for the struggle for freedom and equality, against exploitation and national oppression. However, until Germany's attack on the USSR, the party did not call for open armed uprisings, fearing provocations and mass repression. Everything changed in the summer of 1941, when the Great Patriotic War began, and Moscow began to view the Balkans as an important front in the fight against fascism. From that moment on, the Comintern intensified its work with Yugoslav communists, providing them with not only ideological but also practical assistance. Encrypted messages from Moscow contained instructions on how to organize the underground, carry out sabotage, and create partisan detachments. An important task was to unite the scattered anti-fascist groups under a single command, which allowed Tito and his associates to quickly gain strength and authority among the population. At the same time, London and Washington closely monitored developments, assessing the potential of the Yugoslav resistance as a possible ally in the fight against Hitler's coalition. But it was Moscow that first saw in Tito a figure capable not only of leading the movement, but also of taking it to a new level. Under the control and with the direct support of the Soviet Union. Thus began the story of a secret mission in which the interests of great powers, the fates of millions of people, and the struggle for Yugoslavia's independence were intertwined. After the first secret meetings and coordination of strategy with the Comintern, Josip Broz Tito began forming partisan detachments. This was not simply the creation of armed groups, but an entire system built on the principles of discipline, ideological conviction, and strict secrecy. In every region of Yugoslavia where communist cells were active, the mobilization of volunteers began. People came from all walks of life: workers, peasants, intellectuals, former military personnel. They were united not only by their hatred of the occupiers, but also by their belief in the possibility of building a new, just country. Tito understood that success would require not only arming the people, but also creating a system of command and communication between the units. By the summer of 1941, the first headquarters had been formed in Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Croatia. Each headquarters was responsible for coordinating actions in its region, gathering information about enemy forces, organizing sabotage, and supplying troops. Special attention was paid to ideological work. Each unit had political officers who conducted classes, explained the goals of the struggle, and distributed underground newspapers and leaflets. This helped maintain discipline and prevent demoralization, despite the harsh living conditions in the forests and mountains. It was important not only to fight, but also to win the trust of the local population, who often suffered from repression and looting by the occupiers and collaborators. The first partisan operations were aimed at destroying railway lines and ammunition depots and attacking small garrisons. These actions had not only military, but also psychological significance. They showed that the occupiers were not all-powerful and that resistance was possible. In response, the German and Italian authorities intensified their punitive measures, carried out mass roundups, burned villages, and took hostages. But the cruelty of the enemy only strengthened the determination of the partisans and their supporters. An important feature of the Yugoslav movement was the rapid growth of the underground network. By the fall of 1941, dozens of units were operating in different parts of the country, gradually merging into larger formations. Tito and his closest associates, Edvard Kardelj, Milovan Djilas, and Aleksandar Rankovic, personally oversaw the creation of new bases, supply routes, and channels of communication with Moscow. The partisan detachments were highly mobile. They avoided open battles with large enemy forces, preferring sudden strikes and quick retreats. This tactic allowed them to remain combat-ready even when outnumbered and outgunned. Reconnaissance and informants among the local population played an important role, providing timely warnings of the movements of the occupiers. The first successes inspired people in the occupied cities and villages. More and more volunteers joined the partisans, bringing weapons, food, and clothing. Women and teenagers became couriers, nurses, and scouts. In some areas, the partisans even took control of small settlements, organizing self-government bodies, schools, and hospitals. However, there were as many difficulties as there were victories. There was a shortage of weapons, ammunition, and medicine. In the mountains, there was often no food. People were sick and suffered from cold and fatigue. There were cases of betrayal and failures, when entire groups were surrounded and killed. But despite this, the movement grew, and Tito became an increasingly prominent figure, not only in Yugoslavia, but also beyond its borders. The formation of partisan units under Tito's leadership became one of the key stages in the history of the resistance. It was not just a struggle for survival. It was the beginning of the creation of a new Yugoslavia, in which the ideas of freedom, equality, and independence played a major role. In the first months of forming the units, Tito and his comrades were faced with the need to constantly adapt their tactics. The occupiers quickly realized that they were not dealing with scattered groups, but with an organized force capable of delivering sensitive blows to the enemy's communications and logistics. In response, the German and Italian commands began to deploy large-scale punitive operations aimed at destroying partisan bases and intimidating the population. Tito understood that without the support of the local population, the partisan movement was doomed to defeat. Therefore, special attention was paid not only to military operations, but also to working with the population. In each liberated or temporarily controlled area, People's Liberation Councils were set up to take over the functions of local authorities. They organized food distribution, cared for the wounded, and maintained order and discipline among the troops. An important element was the creation of their own supply system. The partisans set up production of homemade weapons, mines, grenades, and medical supplies. In some areas, underground workshops operated where captured weapons were repaired and ammunition was manufactured. All this was done under constant threat of attack, often in the open air or in abandoned mines and caves. An atmosphere of equality and camaraderie prevailed among the fighters. Unlike regular armies, there was no strict hierarchy here. Commanders were elected at meetings, and decisions were made collectively. This strengthened the spirit of unity and helped overcome difficulties. At the same time, Tito and his entourage carefully monitored discipline, preventing looting, violence against the civilian population, and vigilante justice. Culture played a special role in the lives of the partisans. The detachments had propaganda brigades that organized concerts, read poetry, and staged short plays. This helped to maintain morale, distract from the hardships of war, and remind people of what they were fighting for. Many Yugoslav poets, writers, and artists who later became famous went through the school of partisan camps. With the growth of the number of detachments, the need for centralized management arose. By the end of 1941, the General Staff of the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia had been established, headed by Tito. Under his leadership, plans for large-scale operations were developed, actions between regions were coordinated, and links with Moscow and other allies were established. The first major successes came in the winter of 1942, when the partisans managed to liberate several cities and create so-called free territories. These were areas where Soviet power was in effect, schools and hospitals were operating, and newspapers were being printed. These successes became a symbol of the possibility of victory and inspired thousands of new volunteers to join the fight. However, the enemy had no intention of surrendering. Large-scale offensives began, during which partisan bases were bombed and populated areas were subjected to mass reprisals. In these conditions, the support of the Soviet Union, which began to provide not only moral but also material assistance, became particularly important. More on this in the next chapter. In the first months after establishing ties with Moscow, Tito and his closest associates began to receive the first signals that the Soviet Union was ready to provide real assistance. The situation on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War remained extremely tense, but Stalin and the Comintern leadership understood that support for the Yugoslav partisans could play an important role in the struggle against Nazi Germany and its allies in the Balkans. The first contacts between Yugoslav communists and Soviet representatives took place through a complex network of intermediaries. Encrypted radio messages, couriers, and sometimes personal meetings on neutral territory were used. These negotiations discussed issues of coordination, intelligence sharing, and the transfer of weapons and ammunition. Particular attention was paid to the security of communication channels. The slightest leak of information could lead to the failure of the entire operation and the death of its participants. The most important event was the establishment of direct contact between Tito and Soviet military advisors. At the end of 1942, the first representatives of Soviet intelligence and specialists in the organization of guerrilla warfare were sent to Yugoslavia. They brought with them instructions on how to conduct sabotage operations, samples of weapons, and means of communication that allowed them to maintain regular contact with Moscow. Soviet representatives not only advised Yugoslav commanders, but also participated in planning operations, training fighters in guerrilla warfare tactics, organizing ambushes, and mining roads and railways. In some cases, they themselves took part in combat operations, which strengthened trust between the two sides. Tito, aware of the importance of Soviet support, sought to make the most of the resources provided. He regularly sent reports on the situation to Moscow, requested additional assistance, and shared intelligence on the movements of German and Italian troops. In response, the Soviet leadership provided recommendations on how to conduct combat operations and supplied the partisans with the latest weapons and ammunition. Gradually, contacts between Yugoslav and Soviet representatives became regular. Special liaison groups were set up to coordinate joint operations, transmit information, and organize supplies. Soviet radio operators played an important role in ensuring the smooth operation of communication channels even under the most difficult conditions. During this period, Soviet intelligence activities in the Balkans intensified. Through the Yugoslav partisans, Moscow received valuable information about enemy plans and troop movements, the mood among the population, and the activities of collaborationist regimes. This data was used in planning major operations on the Eastern Front and in other regions of Europe. The first contacts between Tito and Soviet representatives laid the foundation for further cooperation. They made it possible to create a solid foundation for coordinating actions and sharing experience and resources, which ultimately played a decisive role in the success of the Yugoslav resistance and the liberation of the country from the occupiers. From the very first days of establishing regular contacts with Moscow, the Yugoslav partisans felt the real support of the Soviet Union. This support was not limited to moral statements and ideological recommendations. Already in the fall of 1942, the first Soviet missions began to arrive in Yugoslavia, bringing with them weapons, ammunition, medicines, and specialists in the organization of partisan warfare. The Soviet missions operated under the strictest secrecy. Cargo was transported by air in specially equipped aircraft, which dropped containers with weapons and equipment at pre-arranged locations at night. To ensure the safety of such operations, Yugoslav partisans organized special cover groups that guarded the drop-off points and quickly evacuated the cargo to hiding places. The delivery of radio stations and communications equipment was of particular importance. Thanks to Soviet specialists, partisan headquarters were able to maintain constant contact, not only with each other, but also with Moscow. This made it possible to coordinate large-scale operations, receive intelligence and instructions in a timely manner, and report on their successes and needs. Soviet instructors trained fighters in new tactics of sabotage, the use of modern weapons, and the organization of ambushes and minefields. In some cases, they personally participated in combat operations, which strengthened trust between the Allies and boosted the morale of the partisans. An important component of Soviet aid was the supply of medicines and medical equipment. In the conditions of guerrilla warfare, when the wounded often had to be operated on in field hospitals, this aid saved the lives of hundreds of fighters. Soviet doctors and medics shared their experience of organizing medical services in conditions of constant danger. With each passing month, the scale of Soviet support grew. Reports on the situation, requests for additional supplies, and information on enemy movements were regularly sent to Moscow. In response, new shipments, instructions, and proposals for coordinating actions with other anti-fascist forces in the Balkans arrived. Soviet support played a key role in strengthening the partisan units and transforming them into a powerful military force. Thanks to assistance from Moscow, the Yugoslav partisans were able not only to survive in harsh conditions, but also to launch active offensive operations, liberate significant territories, and lay the foundations for a future independent Yugoslavia. Stalin's influence on the strategy of the Yugoslav partisans was felt from the very first days of active cooperation. The Soviet leadership, with its vast experience in underground and guerrilla warfare, sought to introduce its methods and approaches into the activities of the Yugoslav units. Through missions, encrypted messages, and personal contacts, instructions were transmitted on the organization of headquarters, planning of operations, and conducting reconnaissance and sabotage. Stalin believed that the success of the partisan struggle depended on strict centralization of command and strict discipline. At his insistence, a system of single command was introduced in the Yugoslav units, whereby all important decisions were made only after consultation with the highest leadership. This made it possible to avoid disunity and ensure coordinated action even in conditions of isolation and constant threat of encirclement. Soviet advisors recommended that Tito pay special attention to the ideological training of fighters. Political officers appeared in each unit to monitor morale, conduct classes on the history of the revolutionary movement, and explain the objectives of the struggle. This system helped to strengthen morale, prevent panic, and maintain loyalty to the ideals of the party. Under the influence of Moscow, Yugoslav partisans began to use more complex tactical schemes. Particular attention was paid to organizing ambushes, mining roads, and destroying enemy communications. Instructions were developed for conducting reconnaissance and gathering information about troop movements and supplies. These methods allowed the partisans to inflict significant damage on the enemy despite their limited resources. Stalin also insisted on the need for close cooperation with other anti-fascist forces in the Balkans. On his instructions, Tito tried to establish contacts with representatives of various national resistance movements in order to create a united front against the occupiers. However, not everyone agreed to submit to the communist leadership, which led to conflicts and disagreements. An important part of the Soviet strategy was information warfare. Through underground radio stations, leaflets, and newspapers, reports of partisan victories were disseminated. The crimes of the occupiers and their accomplices were exposed, and the fighting spirit of the population was raised. This work was carried out under the strict control of Soviet specialists who monitored the accuracy and effectiveness of the propaganda. Stalin's influence was also felt in personnel policy. On his recommendation, trusted communists with experience in underground struggle and loyalty to the party's ideals were brought into the leadership of the partisan movement. This strengthened the vertical power structure and made the entire resistance more manageable. Thus, the Soviet experience and Stalin's personal influence became key factors in the formation and development of the Yugoslav partisan movement. Thanks to this, it was possible not only to survive in conditions of brutal confrontation, but also to achieve significant successes on the road to the country's liberation. Internal conflicts and the struggle for control became an integral part of the history of the Yugoslav resistance. Despite outward unity, there were deep contradictions between different groups and leaders within the movement. One of the main reasons for these differences was the desire of individual commanders for independence and their unwillingness to submit to strict centralized authority. Following Soviet recommendations, Tito attempted to establish a rigid chain of command. However, many local commanders, especially in remote areas, did not always agree with the decisions of the general staff. They believed that they knew the local conditions better and could organize the struggle more effectively without constant instructions from above. This led to conflicts, sometimes escalating into open confrontation. The issue of cooperation with other anti-fascist groups was particularly acute. In some regions, nationalist formations were active, which also fought against the occupiers, but did not share communist views. Tito's attempts to bring them under his command were often met with resistance and even armed clashes. Soviet advisors insisted on the need for harsh measures against dissidents, which led to repression and purges within the resistance. Internal contradictions were exacerbated by the complex ethnic structure of Yugoslavia. Differences between Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, and other peoples often led to mistrust and mutual accusations. Tito and his entourage made efforts to create a unified ideology based on the principles of internationalism and equality. But in practice, this was not always successful. Information resources played an important role in the struggle for control. Each large unit sought to create its own network of informants and establish newspapers and leaflets to influence the mood of the fighters and the population. This led to competition between different centers of power, which complicated coordination and reduced the effectiveness of the resistance. Despite all the difficulties, Tito managed to maintain his leadership and keep the movement under his control. He skillfully maneuvered between different groups, using both persuasion and force. When necessary, harsh measures were taken: arrests, removal from command, and sometimes even the physical elimination of opposition leaders. Internal conflicts and the struggle for control became a test for the Yugoslav resistance. However, it was precisely under these conditions that the character of the future government was forged, and a team capable of leading the country to victory and independence was formed. The partisan war in Yugoslavia became one of the largest and most brutal chapters of World War II. Hundreds of thousands of men and women, united under Tito's leadership, waged a relentless struggle against the occupiers and collaborationist regimes. This struggle required not only courage and self-sacrifice from its participants, but also tremendous endurance in conditions of constant danger and lack of resources. The partisans' successes were evident. By mid-1943, they had liberated significant territories, established a system of self-government, and set up the production of weapons and medicines. In some areas, schools, hospitals, and local authorities were functioning. This became a symbol of the possibility of building a new, free Yugoslavia. However, the price of victory was extremely high. The occupiers responded to the partisans' activities with mass reprisals, the destruction of villages, and the execution of hostages. Thousands of people were killed, and tens of thousands were deported to concentration camps. Under constant threat of death, the partisans showed incredible resilience, continuing the struggle even after heavy defeats. Large-scale operations, such as the breakout from encirclement in Bosnia, the liberation of cities in Serbia and Montenegro, and the organization of large-scale sabotage of enemy railways and communications, occupy a special place in the history of the partisan war. These actions not only inflicted damage on the enemy, but also inspired the population to resist. Women and young people played an important role. Many girls became couriers, nurses, and scouts. Young fighters were particularly courageous and self-sacrificing, often becoming heroes of legends and songs. Their exploits became an example for new generations. Despite huge losses and difficulties, the partisan movement not only survived, but became one of the most effective resistance forces in Europe. This experience became the basis for future state-building and national reconciliation in Yugoslavia. Secret negotiations and information exchange between Yugoslav partisans and the Soviet Union became one of the key components of the successful struggle against the occupying forces. These contacts developed against the backdrop of constant threat from the enemy, the need to maintain secrecy, and the need to overcome numerous technical and organizational difficulties. At the beginning of the cooperation, information was exchanged via couriers and encrypted radio messages. Yugoslav radio operators, trained by Soviet specialists, maintained contact with Moscow, transmitting reports on the situation at the front, requests for supplies, and information on enemy movements. In response, Moscow sent instructions and recommendations on how to conduct operations, as well as information about enemy plans obtained by Soviet intelligence. Personal meetings between representatives of both sides were of particular importance. Such negotiations were conducted in strict secrecy, often in remote areas that could only be reached by mountain trails or by boat on rivers at night. At these meetings, strategic issues were discussed, plans for major operations were agreed upon, and problems of supply and coordination with other anti-fascist forces were resolved. Soviet representatives passed on not only military information to the partisans, but also political guidelines. Moscow closely monitored the Yugoslav movement to ensure that it remained under the control of the Communist Party and did not deviate from the line approved by Stalin. In the event of disagreements or suspicions of disloyalty, Soviet advisors immediately reported this to the center, which could lead to personnel changes or even repression. Intelligence was a big part of sharing info. Yugoslav partisans gathered information on where German and Italian troops were and how many there were, plans for punitive operations, and how people were feeling. This info was sent to Moscow, where it was analyzed and used to plan operations on the Eastern Front and in other parts of Europe. In turn, the Soviet Union provided the partisans with information about the international situation, the actions of the Allies, and the prospects for opening a second front. This information helped Tito make strategic decisions and build relations with the Western powers. Secret negotiations and information exchange became an integral part of the complex and multifaceted struggle for the liberation of Yugoslavia. Thanks to these contacts, it was possible not only to increase the effectiveness of military operations, but also to preserve the unity of the movement despite internal and external threats. Soviet agents and intelligence in Yugoslavia played a key role in ensuring the effectiveness of the partisan movement. From the very beginning of the cooperation, Moscow sent experienced intelligence officers, sabotage specialists, radio operators, and instructors to the country. Their task was not only to pass on their experience, but also to monitor the actions of Yugoslav commanders and gather information about the internal situation and mood within the resistance. Soviet agents operated undercover, frequently changing their locations and using forged documents. They established contacts with local leaders, participated in planning operations, and trained fighters in reconnaissance and sabotage techniques. Particular attention was paid to creating a network of informants among the local population, which made it possible to identify threats in a timely manner and prevent provocations by the enemy. Radio operators ensured uninterrupted communication with Moscow, transmitting encrypted messages about the course of hostilities, losses, successes, and problems. Thanks to their work, the Soviet leadership was able to respond quickly to changes in the situation, adjust plans, and provide necessary assistance. Soviet intelligence also worked actively against internal enemies. If suspicious individuals, traitors, or enemy agents were identified, harsh measures were taken, including arrests, interrogations, and sometimes liquidation. This policy allowed for a high level of security, but sometimes led to mistakes and unjustified repression. An important task for Soviet agents was also to monitor the loyalty of Yugoslav leaders. Moscow kept a close eye on Tito and his entourage to ensure that they did not deviate from the party line or enter into independent negotiations with Western allies without consulting the USSR. At the slightest sign of suspicion, reports were immediately sent to the center, where decisions on further steps were made. Soviet agents and intelligence in Yugoslavia became an invisible but extremely important element of the partisan war. Their activities ensured coordination, security of movement, and control over the strategic course of the struggle for the country's liberation. The confrontation with the Western Allies became one of the most complex and multifaceted chapters in the history of the Yugoslav resistance. On the one hand, Great Britain and the United States recognized the importance of the partisan struggle against the Nazi occupiers and provided some support. On the other hand, their strategic interests in the Balkans often diverged from the goals of the Soviet Union and Tito's leadership. The first contacts between the Yugoslav partisans and the Western Allies took place through a British mission sent to the Balkans. British officers, acting undercover, established links with various resistance groups, including the Chetniks, who opposed communist influence. This caused discontent in Moscow and suspicions of double-dealing on the part of London. Tito and his entourage understood that without Western support, it would be extremely difficult to achieve final victory. Therefore, they sought to establish direct contacts with British and American representatives, inviting them to the liberated areas to demonstrate the successes and organization of the partisan structures. In response, the Allies supplied limited amounts of weapons, medicines, and communications equipment, but did so with an eye on the political situation and fearing the strengthening of communist influence. Particular tension arose over the future structure of Yugoslavia. The United Kingdom and the United States insisted on the preservation of the monarchy and the return of King Peter II, while Tito categorically rejected this possibility, considering it a threat to independence and the achievements of the resistance. This conflict led to a series of sharp diplomatic clashes, during which each side tried to win the support of the local population and the international community. Information warfare played an important role in the confrontation. Western radio stations broadcast reports of the heroism of the Chetniks and their contribution to the fight against the occupiers, while Soviet and Yugoslav propaganda accused them of collaboration and treason. This battle for the hearts and minds of the population became an integral part of the overall confrontation. Despite all the differences, at decisive moments of the war, the Western Allies recognized the merits of Tito and his movement, increased the amount of aid, and sent their representatives to the partisan headquarters. This allowed for more effective coordination of actions against the common enemy, but did not remove all the contradictions that had already emerged in the post-war period. The confrontation with the Western Allies was an important test for the Yugoslav resistance, demonstrating its ability to defend its independence and its own path of development, even under pressure from the world's major powers. The crisis of trust between Tito and Stalin was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Yugoslav resistance. Despite close cooperation and significant assistance from the Soviet Union, deep differences between the leaders of the two countries began to emerge by the end of the war. This was due not only to differences in strategic approaches, but also to personal ambitions, mistrust, and the struggle for influence in the Balkans. Stalin expected Tito to submit unconditionally and follow the Soviet line on all issues, from the organization of power to foreign policy. However, Tito, relying on the successes of the partisan movement and support within the country, increasingly showed independence, refused to carry out some of Moscow's instructions, and insisted on Yugoslavia's right to determine its own future. The conflict was particularly acute in matters of personnel policy and control over the army. Soviet advisors demanded the appointment of leaders loyal to Moscow, the strengthening of the role of the Communist Party, and purges of unreliable elements. Tito, on the contrary, sought to maintain control over key structures, preventing outside interference. The situation was exacerbated by constant suspicions of disloyalty. Soviet intelligence reported cases of independent negotiations between Yugoslav leaders and Western allies, attempts to conceal information about the real state of affairs, and even possible contacts with anti-Soviet forces. In response, Tito tightened security measures, restricted Soviet agents' access to strategic information, and began to form his own special services. The internal crisis of trust was accompanied by an information war. Articles appeared more and more frequently in the Yugoslav press about the country's right to independence, the need to defend national interests, and the heroism of the partisans and their contribution to victory. In Moscow, these publications were seen as a manifestation of nationalism and a threat to the unity of the socialist camp. Despite attempts to smooth over the contradictions, by the end of the war, the differences between Tito and Stalin had become obvious to all participants in the movement. This predetermined the further development of events and marked the beginning of a new stage in relations between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. Repression and purges among Yugoslav communists became an inevitable consequence of the deepening crisis of confidence and the struggle for control within the movement. Under the influence of Soviet advisors and in response to real and imagined threats, the leadership of the partisan movement began to pursue a harsh policy of identifying and eliminating unreliable elements. The purges primarily affected those who expressed doubts about the correctness of the party's course, showed independence, or maintained contacts with alternative centers of influence. In some cases, suspicion of disloyalty was enough to be investigated or removed from command positions. Arrests, interrogations, and expulsions from the party became commonplace in camps and headquarters. Particular attention was paid to combating enemy agents. The Soviet and Yugoslav secret services worked together to identify suspicious individuals, check their biographies, and analyze their correspondence and reports. If suspicions were confirmed, severe punishments followed, including execution. This policy helped maintain a high level of discipline, but at the same time created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust. The repression affected not only ordinary fighters, but also some commanders who had previously enjoyed authority among the partisans. An atmosphere of suspicion arose within the movement. Internal conflicts intensified, which negatively affected the combat effectiveness and morale of the units. Nevertheless, the leadership of the partisan movement considered such measures necessary to maintain unity and prevent a split. Subsequently, many of those who had been repressed were rehabilitated, and the practice of mass purges was criticized by historians and the public. The Soviet Union's attempts to regain control over the Yugoslav movement continued even after the end of the main hostilities. Moscow viewed Yugoslavia as a key ally in the Balkans and was not prepared to tolerate any signs of independence from Tito and his entourage. The Soviet secret services drew up plans to strengthen their influence over the country's leadership, infiltrate their agents into key structures, and establish new channels of communication and control. Particular attention was paid to working with the party elite, and attempts to win over dissatisfied or ambitious leaders who were willing to cooperate with Moscow in exchange for political support. In some cases, attempts were made to destabilize the situation within the country by spreading rumors, supporting opposition groups, and organizing provocations. Soviet advisors insisted on new purges, tighter ideological control, and the creation of special commissions to combat deviations and nationalist tendencies. However, Tito and his associates managed to maintain control of the situation. They strengthened their own special services, limited the influence of Soviet agents, carried out personnel changes, and intensified propaganda promoting the country's independence and sovereignty. As a result, the USSR's attempts to regain full control over Yugoslavia were unsuccessful and only exacerbated the rift between the two countries. The breakdown of relations between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union was one of the most dramatic events in post-war European history. After a series of mutual accusations, diplomatic démarches, and public statements of distrust, the alliance was officially dissolved in 1948. The Soviet Union declared the Yugoslav leadership traitors to the socialist cause, cut off economic and military aid, and recalled its advisors and specialists. In response, Tito and his entourage declared the country's right to an independent path of development, strengthened measures to ensure internal security, and began to seek new sources of support outside the Soviet bloc. The break with the USSR was accompanied by severe economic difficulties, international isolation, and the threat of military intervention. However, the Yugoslav leadership managed to mobilize resources, carry out reforms, and establish relations with Western countries, which made it possible to avoid disaster and preserve independence. The consequences of the breakup had a huge impact on Yugoslavia's domestic and foreign policy. The country became one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, pursued a course of independence and balance between East and West, which secured it a special place in world politics in the second half of the 20th century. The legacy of Tito and Stalin's secret mission is still a matter of debate among historians and the general public. Some believe that it was Soviet support and experience that enabled the Yugoslav partisans to survive and win in the harshest conditions of war. Others point to Tito's independence, his ability to maneuver between the great powers, defend the interests of his country, and pursue an independent policy. The secret mission became an example of the complex relationship between allies when the common goal of defeating fascism was combined with a struggle for influence, control, and ideological dominance. Yugoslavia's experience showed that even in the face of external threats, it is possible to maintain independence and pursue one's own course. In modern historical science, there are increasing calls for an objective assessment of events, consideration of all points of view, and rejection of ideological stereotypes. The legacy of Tito and Stalin's secret mission is not only a story of struggle and victory, but also a lesson about the price of independence, the complexity of choice, and responsibility to future generations.